Hello, everyone. My name is Darla Saunders, and on behalf of the Atlantic Salmon Conservation Foundation and the Canadian Rivers Institute, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. The series is made possible in part thanks to the contributions of the Government of Canada. For today's webinar, we're very pleased to be hosting Stephen Booth. Stephen Booth is a doctoral candidate in rural studies at the University of Guelph. His research is centered on the three communities of the Listuguj watershed and their understanding and practices in regard to the Atlantic salmon. His interest in both the place and the salmon goes back over 30 years. He has fished the Listuguj. He is Vice Chairman of the Natural Resources Advisory Committee of Trout Unlimited Canada and a member of the board of the Nova Scotia Salmon Association. He lives in Chester, Nova Scotia. After the presentation, we'll be opening the floor for a question and answer session. You'll have the option of asking your questions directly using your microphone, or you can type them in and we'll read them aloud. I will now turn the webinar over to Stephen.
Thank you very much, Dalla, and thank you, Heather, and my thanks to Stephen Case from the Canadian Salmon Fund, and to Alan Curry and Rick Kujek from the Canadian Rivers Institute. I'm privileged to be able to speak to you and to those who've signed up for this today, because I have my own amateur background in conservation, rock rolling, habitat renewal, and that sort of thing. I know that most people who follow these webinars, and I follow them myself, listen to some of them myself, I come from a scientific and a background, a fisheries background, and that you're largely, in fact, entirely practical people. This presentation is a little different insofar as the focus is as much or indeed more on people than it is on the fish, although it is the fish that, as one of the people I spoke to in the Listuguj says, holds it all together. Just a word about the research itself for the academics amongst you. The research addresses intercultural conflict over a natural resource, the Atlantic salmon. It's left unresolved. That kind of a conflict puts into question the survival of not only the species, but the cultures and the rural communities that are involved with that species. And the importance of this research beyond the Listuguj is based on the fact that conflict over natural resources is a universal indicator in the 21st century struggle for cultural survival, species survival, and rural community survival. But in fact, it arises from my own experience of unresolved competition between culturally conflicted communities over access to and use of the Atlantic salmon of the Listuguj watershed. As Dalla just said, I've been privileged to fish on the Listuguj, the first New Brunswick tributary of the Listuguj, for over 30 years, and that's where my interest in this began. But now for something completely different, as I say in Monty Python. You may wonder why I'm showing you a picture of a famous Canadian painting, one of Lauren Harris's paintings from Baffinland of the 1920s. There's something missing in this picture. It's an iconic Canadian picture of the True North Strong and Free, but it's not exactly a picture of Baffinland in the 1920s. To get a fuller picture, we'd have to add the people of Baffinland. A recent critic of Harris's painting said, "It's as if Harris's spiritual quest, his search for ever more refined and exalted states, could be practiced only by erasure." So the picture I just showed you has no people in it, amongst other things. There's been an erasure of the people of Baffinland, and by an ignoring of the wider social context. And it's going to be that wider social context that I'll be discussing this afternoon. Another version of Harris's painting, not completely without people, but nevertheless a painting that involves that process of erasure, is this wonderful sporting art painting that will be familiar to some of you. And it's of a specific place, but it's also for those of you who spend time on the river or rivers, either in research or as anglers, or perhaps both, conjures up very much the spirit of angling, angling for salmon. it's an idyllic sort of picture. And it, as I said, involves a certain amount of erasure. As we look for ever more refined states, as our fly fishing becomes ever more refined, perhaps some of you try to do as much dry fly fishing as possible, and others use light tackle and this sort of thing. As we go through that process, and indeed as we use language that suggests that angling is an art, we withdraw ourselves more and more from that social context to which I want to speak. And it's to that issue that I want to, at least in part, address this afternoon. Some of you will also recognize this photograph. This photograph was taken just a few hundred yards from the scene of the last painting. And it begins to show the larger social context of the river that is this particular river that is the home to Atlantic salmon. This is a picture of an outfitter's beach with the canoes that he rents to those people who want to travel the river and to camp along the river and to picnic along the river. That's part of the reality of many of our salmon rivers, and certainly of the Listuguj system. A larger social context also has the context of the industries that use these river valleys that are the home to the Atlantic salmon. Both Quebec and New Brunswick, as we all know, are home to corporate forestry, logging roads, logging trucks, logging equipment, mills, although there are fewer and fewer mills, unfortunately, for the people who live in these communities. But nevertheless, that's part of the larger social context. And then, of course, there are the people. There are both historic and contemporary presences beyond those of us who only spend time on the salmon rivers when we are on vacation, when we have a little time to ourselves. There are people who live there today and have lived there for centuries, such as the Acadian people in New Brunswick in the Listuguj watershed rather. And talking to Acadians, I happened to take a photograph of this bumper sticker, which I will translate rather freely, not, I think, literally. But the message on the bumper sticker in English, as I understand it, could be corrected on this, is that it's basically asking a question. The forest in which they live now and have lived for several centuries, it's ours, is it not? Well, of course, that's a highly contentious issue given the presence of the forestry industry out there. And then on the right-hand side, some of you know the Listuguj is part of the Canadian Heritage River System. And this is a sign at Ketchwick River in 3 languages, the 3 languages of the watershed, namely English, French, and Mi'kmaq. And the larger social context includes memories of the people of that watershed. And this isn't a very good photograph, but it's a photograph which says "We remember." It's one of the ways in which the Mi'kmaq people of Listuguj have found identity for themselves and a new beginning in terms of strengthening their community and making it into a healthy community. So that larger social context in which the salmon live and in which anglers angle and people work and live and try to continue their cultures is also part of a larger global context of survival. Given my audience, I assume that we're all aware of the fact that our biosphere is in danger of losing many species, both plants and animals. You figure there is 17,000 face extinction. I'm sure there are other figures, but the basic message is the same. A quarter of mammals, a third of amphibians are in danger of extinction. But beyond that, and most importantly for this social study of salmon and the environment, is the fact that the cultural ethnosphere throughout the world is threatened. 21% of over 7,000 languages are threatened. And when we lose a human language, we lose far more than simply the language. We lose the culture that contains the language, and we lose the knowledge of that culture, or a good part of the knowledge of that culture. So that's also seen by many people to be a threat to human survival as well as to animal and plant survival. And then more locally, and again, I'm assuming that many of you in the audience today, as I do, live in rural communities, and if you don't, you certainly work in them. If you're concerned with the survival of the salmon, you're well aware of rural communities. So you're aware of the fact that there's been great loss of employment over the years in New Brunswick and Quebec and here in Nova Scotia. That rural communities are either static in their populations or their populations are declining. That many young people in our communities migrate out of those communities. And those of you who are taxpayers in the Maritime and Atlantic provinces are aware of the fact that as provincial debt increases, that leads to reduction of services and the fact that it's more and more difficult to sustain rural communities. And then perhaps this slide is a little redundant given my audience, but nevertheless, the survival of the Atlantic salmon itself is in some question. The survival of the salmon in the Listuguj River watershed. Yes, there are bad seasons, and then there are better seasons. But the commercial fishery has been closed in the Listuguj now for closing on 50 years, and yet numbers continue to decline. And perhaps more alarming, and certainly alarming to the people of Listuguj, is that the size of fish seen in the watershed seems to be declining as our decade over decade rod catches. And perhaps most telling of all in this regard, as I understand it, and the people I know who are online watching this, and some of my information comes from them, spawning escapement is still well, for the rescue system, is well below, as a whole, is well below what is deemed necessary by either DFO or Quebec, and they measure them in different ways, or indeed the Listuguj Mi'kmaq government itself. And in the larger picture, again, for instance, where I live, and on the southern uplands of Nova Scotia, which used to have many fine salmon rivers, DFO now speak of them as being or about to be extirpated. So this animal, so the salmon. Salmon is a symbol of identity. It's not merely an animal. It's not merely a food. It's not merely a source of economic income for communities. It's a symbol as well. It's a basis for the formation of communities. It defines the differences between communities, and it's one of the ways in which communities of the Listuguj watershed and others communicate with one another. The salmon is, as many people have told me, it's who we are. It forms and defines our community. It also differentiates, as I just said, between communities, because the different communities have different practices in regard to the salmon, as you know, and as we'll see a little later in this presentation. It's symbolic both of conflict and of cooperation, and again, we'll see some ways in which there is conflict in practices and cooperation. And indeed, the salmon affects both the realities of ownership and livelihood of the economy, and the exercise of power. And these are things that go beyond the limits, the proper limits of normal scientific investigation. Here's, of course, the Listuguj watershed, and you'll recognize that that's the Van Buren Bridge there, and that's a picture of a salmon being caught by a fisherman. It's in a place that's not generally traveled by fishermen, but it's part of the identity of Campbellton. It's part of their waterfront, and it evokes the place. Below it, you'll see a picture taken just across the river at the Guelph Mi'kmaq Resource Center during the recent salmon feast, Pamu feast, in which a young Mi'kmaq is gutting a salmon, and a young scientist who was born and grew up and continues to live in the watershed is explaining the anatomy of that salmon to a young Mi'kmaq person. The three communities all share the same place. They all identify with the same animal, but they have different ways of identifying. There are different meanings assigned to the salmon, different ways of understanding the salmon and indeed the world in which they live, and different practices. As a Mi'kmaq friend of mine said to me, we're conflicted and entangled. That is to say, the communities are conflicted and entangled. But we need to be untangled and, he said, rewoven. So how do you do that? Well, I'm not going to put up to tell you how to do that, maybe point to some ways. But before we do that, perhaps we should be realistic about the fact that there are, within these three communities, different ways of knowing. Not everyone knows what they know in the same way. Most of my listeners, I'm sure today, in fact all of my listeners necessarily, will participate in the world of Western science. We're objective people, we're rational people, we're positivistic, we want to know the facts, we're very keen on gathering data, and if policies are to be decided, we like to use data, factual data, as evidence on which to base those facts. We are indeed scientific people, and indeed it would be very difficult to live in the world today without being in some degree influenced by that way of thinking. But traditional societies, and I would include in traditional societies a little bit of just every one of us, but certainly Mi'kmaq, and I would say many of the rural people of that district, still get their knowledge, still understand the world in which they live in traditional worlds. They practice some key ways in which this happens. They practice reverential thinking. They believe that it's possible to use your imagination in order to be empathetic with other human beings and indeed with the natural world. There's intrinsic value in the other, not just the other human, but as I just said, the natural world. We believe in I-thou relationships, not I-it relationships. And I myself was educated in the scientific way of thinking, and I'm part of a culture that's dominated by it. So I understand the benefits of I-it relationships, where one can objectify the thing that one is studying, and we've obviously benefited hugely from that. But traditional societies value as well I-thou relationships, which is an equality between the persons, or the person and the other who's being experienced. Traditional thinking is an ongoing process, ongoing learning through open participation. There's no professor who's pouring knowledge into empty-headed students here. People are on an equal basis, and the learning occurs through dialogue between equals. And that learning involves taking action, but after the action, time again to reflect, time to talk on an equal basis before taking further action. There's some of the key factors in traditional thinking, and of course in Western science. Those two ways of knowing, broadly described there, are present within these three communities. These three communities also don't have the same practices in regard to the salmon. The practices are grounded in and inform their ways of understanding. The top picture is of the net fishery at Listuguj. The bottom picture is of, I think, one of my guides releasing one of our fish. So the ways in which our practices are formed are dependent upon the way in which we know stuff. We can know it through Mi'kmaq ecological knowledge, MAQ. We can know it through Western science. Those things in turn affect the way in which we think the salmon fishery ought to be managed. But they also affect our investment in agency and control. Who is it that makes decisions about seasons? Who is it that makes decisions about how many fish can be caught, whether fish should be live released? Who is in control of this fishery and the various parts of it? Just to step back for a moment and talk a little bit about my own process of learning. My interest in this began because as a member of a family that owns one of the salmon camps, I started to go to the New York meetings of the Listuguj River Camp Owners Association. And the first two meetings that I attended, and they're held in New York, not on the banks of the Listuguj, we had as our guest Chief Alison Metallic from Listuguj, then the chief, and two different assistants over 2 different years. And they came and they told their story about their community. And they told it on one of those occasions through showing the film Incident at Listuguj, 1981. If you haven't looked at that, look it up on YouTube. It's well worth seeing. And that is, I'll say again a little later, is the foundational event for the comeback of their community. When I say comeback, I'm using a phrase that those of you who are from Canada and read John Ralston Saul, or have read John Ralston Saul's recent book, The Comeback, about First Nations in Canada, will understand. There's a process for our non-Canadian friends that's going on in Canada at the moment, in which we're revisiting our relationship with First Nations, not only in the legal and economic sense, but in the moral sense as well. And part of that is this whole issue of agency. Who determines what is going to happen to a community, to individuals within these communities? And then a fourth part of the context of my own learning is that I have, in my reading, been affected by the notion that ecology is not a hard science. It's not a straightforward science. That there are such things as ecologies of the heart, ways of interacting with one's environment that are driven by emotion, belief, sense of identity. Some of you may be familiar with Ian Anderson's book of that title, Ecologies of the Heart. So the communities and cultures of the Listuguj share a common place and a common symbolic animal. But that animal touches upon everyone's emotions. It touches on everyone's beliefs. In fact, the way in which it's understood is based on the way in which one forms one's beliefs. And one's identity is also affected by one's understanding of the salmon and one's interaction with it. The salmon is one of the factors that allows people to find meaning in their lives. But we do that, the communities of the Listuguj do that in differing ways. And so when I began the research part of this, I had to, like every researcher and student, I had to decide on what my approach was going to be. And here the basis for my approach is the notion that when people or communities, cultures, societies choose their narratives, which is a fancy word, I guess, for stories, we also choose our ethics. That's an idea that David Brooks, the New York columnist, has promulgated. When we choose our stories, we choose our ethics. When we choose what stories we're going to tell about ourselves, when we choose what stories we're going to tell about others, then we're also deciding how we're going to act in regard to ourselves and to others, and in this case, towards the environment and the salmon. And so I went out into these 3 communities, and over the time passes, over the past 3 years now, I've conducted over 60 interviews with members of all 3 communities. And out of that, I've been able to construct core narratives for each of the communities. And I have spent a good deal of extremely pleasant, enjoyable time in the Listuguj River Watershed and in its communities. And so part of what I'm doing today is what I've done with various groups who've been helping with this over the last year or so. Namely, as one of my Mi'kmaq friends said, telling it like it is, sharing the narratives. And I want to do that with you now. Tell it like it is. Well, I spoke with people who believe the things that you see on your screen now, and clearly they're contradictory in many ways. I've spoken with people who believe that a caught and released salmon is a dead salmon, who believe that the private camps not only involve a lot of money, but make a lot of money in the profitable enterprises. I've spoken with people who believe that sport fishing damages the salmon resource, despite live release. I've spoken with people who believe that as long as the waters run, the salmon will return, and people who believe that the salmon are indeed threatened and may not survive. I've spoken with people who say that live release is a key to conservation. Many of the people participating in this webinar, I'm sure, are part of that. That group is indeed I am. The Listuguj salmon fishery is unregulated, some people believe. With rights come responsibilities for ensuring survival of the salmon, others believe. And management is their responsibility. And I think each of the three groups in one way or another believes that management is their responsibility. And then I've heard from some of the people I've spoken to that they want, above all, to be in relationship with others who find their identity and sense of meaning in the salmon. So, as the Mi'kmaq friend said, hear the story, accept the story. Don't try to say what's wrong with it, pick it apart, that sort of thing. Just hear the story, accept the story, try to understand the story, try to understand why, whatever the story is, it's being told that way. And then try to deepen the story. And so in my interviews, I looked at what anglers, settlers, and the Mi'kmaq say about the place, the watershed and their place in it, what they say about the salmon, what they say about their neighbours, and what they say about conservation. What anglers say about this place and their place in it. My father took me fishing. I bought this camp 30 years ago. I've been coming here for 40 years. This is something our family does. What they said about the salmon. Well, it's all about conservation. Salmon is all about conservation. And live release is a tool. It's an ecology of the heart of the angler. So many appeals, as you may, well, most of you would know, to get all anglers to release all their salmon. Speaks of the feeling that people have when they release a salmon. That's an ecology of the heart. As one angler said to me, I can fish for them without hurting them. But other anglers take a more pessimistic view of the future of the Atlantic salmon and angling for it and say there's a sense that it is coming to an end. What do the anglers think about what I'm calling here the settlers, the people, the local people whom they meet? Well, and I say we because I'm an angler, we're big on the economic relationship. The camp owners hired economists from UNB who showed that annual cash expenditures of $10 million are put out by the camps. So we hire 530 part-time equivalent jobs. And that our camps provide an important engine of economic activity in the region. There are personal, social, and cultural relationships with settlers. There's respect, admiration, affection, and long-term relationships with camp staff, but few personal relations with resident communities, residents of the communities, or acknowledgement of their cultures. The notion that residents might regard, these are residents who don't work in the camps, what camp owners understand and articulate to be our waters, as indeed their heritage and birthright to be enjoyed in their own ways. That sometimes seems to be hidden from those of us, some of us in the Anglican, sorry, I am an Anglican, but not the Anglican, in the angling community. What do anglers say of the people of Listuguj? Well, there's very little direct contact. I've spoken to people who've been fishing there for years who've never actually met a member of the Listuguj First Nation. There's virtually no acknowledgement made by anglers of the place of the Listuguj First Nation within the place that is the Listuguj. We acknowledge the right of Mi'kmaq to fish, but the common understanding of the Listuguj fishery expressed by interviewees is of an unregulated blockade of the river mouth. Those of you who haven't spent any time in camps when we're not catching fish will know that sooner or later the conversation comes around to saying that the Indians have got the nets stretched clear across the river. The large and smaller fish are being caught and killed in drift nets, sold and bought unlawfully by non-natives or wasted. Of course, that's a picture far from their understanding of a quote indoor sustenance and commercial, and ceremonial rather, fishery. And there is, understandably, I think, bemusement at the apparent contradiction between the stated importance of the salmon to Mi'kmaq cultural survival and fishing practices that appear to anglers to be destructive of the salmon resource. And so, anglers often express frustration and anger. There was a letter in the Globe and Mail about 2 or 3 weeks ago on this very subject, making that same bemusement point. So what do the settlers say about this? What do they say about the place and their place in it? We all live off the river. Everybody has a tie to the river. There's a meaning for everyone. It's a spiritual place. As one person I spoke to said, the day I can pack the Listuguj River in my suitcase is the day I'll leave. It ties it all together. But on the other hand, Many local people say the river is not really ours, is it? And what they say about the communities, their uncertainty about employment and their economic future, the migration of young people and therefore the breakup of families who've lived together in that area, sometimes for generations, and now the young are living in Ontario or other places. Conflict over the forest. The forest, it's ours, surely, isn't it? But is it really ours? Do we have a right to live in rural places, a right to rurality, to live a rural way of life, like themselves? There's fear and depression over the survival of their rural river-based lives. One interviewee spoke to me about his neighbours who, during the winter, take the lead pill, a bullet to the brain. But at the end of the day, everybody is intertwined. What do they say about the salmon? Well, they say the Listuguj River is a hell of a nice river, but if you take the salmon out of it, what's left? Sightseeing? Nothing is going to bring money to the Listuguj River the way the salmon does, they say. And there is a history of exclusion from the sport fishery for the local people, and at least in New Brunswick, very limited present opportunities. And the salmon is for them, as for the Mi'kmaq, a talisman for the health of the region, whether from a biological or a socio-economic point of view. What the Sandlers told me about their Listuguj neighbours was interesting. First of all, it was largely positive. Full acknowledgement of their historic presence, in gratitude for the help of the Mi'kmaq in their own survival. Both as settlers, whether they're Quebecois or Acadians, case of the Quebecois and Acadians, appreciation for the fact that the Mi'kmaq sided with them against the British during the 18th century. And the incident of 1910 when Campbellton was burned to the ground and the Mi'kmaq took the settlers in. It's still appreciated and remembered. They share schooling together. And of course, there's a great deal of intermarriage and has been for 300 years. And there's economic interdependence, indeed, dependence. Listuguj, as a First Nation community, is relatively economically stable, indeed possibly, from some points of view, well off. And their economic impact on Campbellton, which is economically, I think, depressed, is certainly very, very important, and that's recognized by the people of Campbellton. What they said in terms of the settlers said in terms of the salmon and the Mi'kmaq, I don't think buying them off does justice. There's room for everyone to share the salmon resource. And although none contested the Mi'kmaq right to fish, with that right, many others said, comes the obligation to ensure that the stocks are maintained for future generation. There exists a more general feeling of resentment among non-Indigenous residents that it's unfair to have two sets of rules for people who have shared and continue to share a common space and resource. What do they say about the anglers? Well, many of the people I spoke to work at the camps and share the fishing with anglers. So for the guides, it's a way of life. It's my life. One of the worst days of the last day of this is the last day of the season on the river. A guide told me everything is over. They acknowledge the economic contribution of anglers. And indeed, that's broader than just the people who work in the camps. But other people in the business community, and this is from Campbellton, believe that there isn't a strong enough dialogue between the business community in Campbellton, indeed perhaps throughout the watershed, and the Anglican community. And the angling industry, as they put it, has never been connected with the area, I was told. But the river will keep running. Maybe people will find some other way than salmon fishing of utilizing the river system. And so what do the people of Listuguj say about the place, their territory, which is Mi'kmaq? I'm sitting in Mi'kmaq now on the south shore of Nova Scotia. I'm in the potato region, but Guelph is the region, the seventh region, where the Listuguj watershed is. They say that to be a Mi'kmaq from Listuguj is to be in relationship with the land and the waters and the animals and the fish. They are our life. And they say we are one with other people, with animals, and indeed with all of creation. And they say, and this contrasts very much with the view of many of us who've grown up in a Western scientific modern sort of frame of mind. They say the past is always present in our memories and always affects their understanding of what's going on in the present. Whereas, as you know, in my own culture, which I share with many of you, scientific Western culture, we have a strong tendency to be ahistorical. We want to deal with the issue that's immediately before us. Never mind what happened in the past. Let's deal with what we've got in front of us. Let's move on from there. What do the Mi'kmaq say about the gift of Plamu, the Mi'kmaq word for salmon? It's our memory and our belief is that the Creator sustains us with the gift of the salmon. It's our principal food, the source of our health. To fish for it is our right and our responsibility to our families and to our community. As long as the waters run, the salmon will return and we will fish for them. And between themselves, they differ on their understanding of Plamu. Not everyone in the community fishes. And there are some conflicts between those who fish and those who don't. But my sense is that everyone would defend that right against any outside attempt to limit it, as you can see in the event of 1981. There's an ambiguity around the possibility of being paid not to fish. Sometimes the situation in the Cascapedia comes up in relation to the Listuguj, where at the moment at least, through cash payments, there is no native fishery, as I understand it, on the Cascapedia. Some seem to be open to putting much more severe limits on the number of fish killed in return for cash compensation, while others reject this outright. There is no single story in their community any more than there is in any of the other communities. But they do want to participate in management of the salmon fishery. They want to contribute through a combination of Western management and science, Mi'kmaq ecological knowledge and science. And they believe that they can, at least in part, staff management through the present warden system and through the young people who are being trained as scientists in their community. They believe that Mi'kmaq ecological knowledge can be shared through Mi'kmaq guides, more Mi'kmaq guides working in the camps. There's one camp that's always had Mi'kmaq guides that's well over a century old, but at the moment, I think I'm right in saying there are no others. There is an attempt to train Mi'kmaq guides and to introduce them into the camps. But they're concerned that their knowledge may not be sold and somehow be commoditized. Yeah, made into a commodity. They believe that there are limits to management and wonder if it's appropriate to manage the fishery without first dealing with issues of injustice in both historical and present management. And again, the events of 1981, the conflict between the people of Listuguj and the government of Quebec, remain central to their sense of identity. It is central to their comeback. On conservation, there are, contrary to views expressed over a few drinks in the camps when we're not catching fish, there are Mi'kmaq seasons, the fishing times, there are harvest limits. There is such a thing as Mi'kmaq law. I was told that the big early fish are allowed, and this is believed by the community, that the big early fish, the spawners, are allowed to run upriver to spawn. They don't begin fishing until after that's over. They have organized in the last 2 years 2 salmon summits, which are symbols of their openness and cooperation, powerful commitment to conservation, in which members of the federal and provincial governments and angling community and conservation community meet together in Listuguj to discuss the issues around the salmon at those salmon summits. They actively promote 2-eyed seeing, Mi'kmaq ecological knowledge, and Western science. It's not an either or, choose one, but you can choose both. How do you do that? It's another question. There's cooperation in the collection of data, but many members of the community regard requests for such information, data, such as how many fish have we caught this year, or changing practices, as yet another form of control. And that's, again, that larger social context, historical context, and indeed present-day context of the status and the standing of First Nations people within the larger communities of New Brunswick, Quebec, Canada. They also believe that there are local threats to the salmon, such as poaching and logging, and they are concerned more than anyone else about the effects of pollution upon their health. What they told me about their neighbours, they acknowledge the long history of contact, including intermarriage and shared schooling. They reported a history of racially based injustice, including exclusion from the salmon fishery. That went on for the better part of a century, where by de jure or in practice, they were excluded from the salmon fishery, the very thing that brought them to the shores of the Listuguj in the first place after the end of the Ice Age. Loss of the use of their lands and waters, segregation on and off the reserve, poverty and unemployment based on racial exclusion from job opportunities. It's only very recently that they've been able to be integrated into the job opportunities presented by the mill in Atholville. Nevertheless, they expressed a desire to be in relationship with their neighbours. We're conflicted and entangled, but we need to be untangled and rewoven. New relationships need to be built. Again, as I've said, they believe that camps are money makers. They believe, in fact, I didn't talk to a single Mi'kmaq who believed that caught and released fish would survive. They believe that more broadly that we anglers use and damage a resource that is to the Mi'kmaq a source of food, of well-being and cultural survival, so that there's a sort of competition set out there. The fact that in the recent past they were prohibited from fishing while sport fishers were enabled is seen as an ongoing injustice. The present environmental crisis, they believe, presumably with some justification, is far more the result of the behavior of our culture and our communities and society than it is of theirs. And they complain that there is no relationship between anglers and the Mi'kmaq. Okay, what about the conservation of the salmon? Anglers say it's all about conservation. They believe that by practicing live release, we can fish for these fish without hurting them. And we believe that there's a need for everyone in the watershed to stop killing in order to persuade, for instance, Greenlanders and others, perhaps part of the Quebec fishery, although those regulations changed partially this year, to do the same. If we don't stop our killing, how can we make the point to others? But others say, if you can't keep a grilse, what's the point? I won't come. And there is fear that that will have a negative economic impact on the local communities. Settlers say that we live in a paradise, but the paradise has been abused. The government underestimates the capacity of the river. We're mainly managing people and behavior rather than salmon. We don't always get along. There's something to be said for protecting the watershed. We don't agree on the means to do it. We gave up the commercial fishery. This is the Campbellton area. We've done our part. And how long is it going to go on? There's so many issues, but the first and foremost that settlers say is that that needs to be dealt with is the native fishery. And there is support on some part of some. There's also fear and questioning of live release. Listuguj First Nation says of conservation of the salmon, again, it's going to go on. The river runs, the salmon will keep coming. There's no point in my saying to them, well, that's not the case here in the Southern Highlands of Nova Scotia. It wasn't the case in the part of the north of England where I was born and grew up. There are no salmon there now. They say that more needs to be done by governments. They say that the spring spawners go upriver. They do have a law, they do have a plan. And they do want to integrate their own knowledge with that of Western knowledge. And perhaps most importantly here, there is ongoing cooperation between the Guelph Mi'kmaq Resource Council and the Listuguj River Watershed Management Council. As I said, there have already been 2 salmon summits. So we have shared symbols and we have a shared place. The place is perceived in different ways. For some, it's their territory, their home given to them by the Creator. For some, there's a right to rurality. There's Champlain's dream lives amongst the Acadians and no doubt many Quebecois. It's a place of economic opportunity. It's a place in which one can escape, or to which one can escape. As one camp owner said to me, it's lightweight goal orientation and a beautiful environment. It's, as I would say, total erasure. Our practices and understanding of the salmon differ. We can see them through Mi'kmaq ecological knowledge. We can see them through science. We can see them with both together. There are both rights and obligations involved here. So the core narratives, this is reducing those 60 interviews as much as one possibly can, and of course reducing things necessarily distorts them. But for anglers, the core narrative around the salmon, the communities and themselves, is conservation of the salmon and of our sporting and social traditions. To keep going to those camps with our friends, to be able to practice erasure, that exclusion, that sense of wonderful camaraderie in a slightly unreal but nevertheless enjoyable world before we have to go back into the world of competition and work. For settlers, the core narrative is one of survival of the communities and the cultures, of a healthy environment and of a rural way of life and of their economy. And for the Listuguj, and I think for many other First Nations people, that the core narrative seems to have become revival of a healthy community exercising its rights, growing in strength, growing in competences, growing in numbers. And to do that, not through the rejection of traditional practices, but through traditional practices, through traditional forms of governance, through the revival of their language, and indeed of their spiritual traditions, through Mi'kmaq knowledge, and of course, through economic development. And so how do we build bridges between these communities? Well, when we learn together, when we interact together, then we begin to build social capital. And with social capital comes increased capacity and greater ability to act together, to come to common policies, to see those policies implemented through political action. Planning, learning, shared commitment, trust, reciprocity lead to strengthened leadership. And there are groups who work on this. The Listuguj River Watershed Management Council is known to many of you. Some of you are on this feed, I think, are very active in it. This is an attempt to bring together everyone with an interest in that watershed and its salmon to the table, no matter what ways of knowing they may have, no matter what their cultural or community background is, and to join together in the work of preserving that watershed, preserving the communities, preserving the cultures, preserving the salmon. The Listuguj Mi'kmaq government are actively involved in this process as well. And they're members of the Listuguj River Watershed Management Council, as is the Guelph Mi'kmaq Resource Council, which works closely, shares staff with the Listuguj River Watershed Management Council. Wonderful examples of a collaborative process. But this is also a learning process. How do people come to change? How do we come to behave in different ways, change our practices? Well, anglers have gone from catching and killing, and we killed thousands and thousands of tons of these fish. I talked to people still alive whose job was to bring the dead fish out of the camps and get them on the trains. That's gone, practically gone. Now we practice live release. So a learning process has occurred and change has occurred. The settlers had the hardest, in many ways, learning process. They've gone from a thriving commercial fishery, which for almost 200 years provided a great income for the Lower River, to conservation and reliance upon the sport fishery for employment and local spending, to a hope for economy of tourism. They have moved from dependence on industry to new demand for a right to reality and economic security. The First Nation of Listuguj has had to move from exclusion by rules to assertion of rights and practices to self-regulation. And this is a process that's going on day by day and week by week in that community, using traditional and scientific research. And they have to become leaders in cooperation for conservation through the Guelph Mi'kmaq Resource Council. So those two organizations that I've spoken of are key to what's going on in the Listuguj. And they're key to being intentional about bridge building by the very fact that they exist, by the fact that they meet together, they talk together formally and informally, they work together to turn what are known as weak links into strong ties. They are, the best of days, listening to one another, hearing the story, accepting the story, understanding the story, deepening the story. Together they are a forum for untangling and reweaving. Learning to live together in good ways happens through sharing stories and practicing reconciliation in our everyday lives. This comes from the larger context of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report that many of you Canadians will have read or be well aware of. To recognize and respect the other communities and cultures of the watershed, including their dependence on and love of the place. We all love the place. We love it in different ways, but one person's love is no less valuable than another person's love. And we have to recognize each community's right to determine and live in their own ways. We need to build non-directive learning relationships with both Listuguj and non-Indigenous residents and anglers through the Listuguj River Watershed Management Council, through salmon summits and other informal initiatives. These are some of the groups that can develop in that kind of an atmosphere, can develop these collaborative roles, and that includes the ASCF and CRA and many of others that you who've been listening to me for too long now participate in. As we work together on habitat health, stock assessment and management of the salmon, we learn with and from each other, we turn weak links into strong ties, we create new communities of practice, we create social capital for conservation, survival and revival. It's only by deepening, acknowledging and sharing our stories that our communities, our cultures and the salmon will survive. So thank you if you're still with me. Merci. Walalin. And especially, Walalin, thank you, Plamu, for the salmon. Now, I think
Thank you very much, Stephen. That was a really interesting, fascinating presentation on a very complex topic. So we'll now open the session for a question and answer period. So you have two options. You can ask a question using your webinar control panel, which is the little gray box that you should be seeing in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If your box is minimized, just hit the orange box with a white arrow and that will enlarge it. So if you're using the audio of your computer, you can figuratively raise your hand, which is the yellow icon with the green arrow. We can unmute you and you can ask your question directly to Stephen, or you can type in your question on the control panel and we can read it aloud.